I'm going to open this out with a few framing remarks, really. Of course, in the Growth Commission, it's mandatory that we all write books, so we have a Growth Commission library. So I'm going to draw from the most recent book I did on market distortions, which includes the economic models that we have developed over the last 25 years. And these models, the ACMD model, the distortions model, looks at regulatory issues, and it looks at three fundamental pillars that are closely correlated to GDP per capita growth. So movements in these pillars are closely correlated to GDP per capita, and these are basically international competition, which is essentially your trade openness. That includes tariffs, it includes trade facilitation, it includes non-tariff barriers that are at the border principally. That's one pillar. The second pillar is the domestic competition pillar, which is really about that regulatory side of things. It's really about how well does your domestic regulatory system deliver competition on the merits as a sort of organising economic principle. And that's also correlated closely to GDP per capita. And then the third pillar is the property rights pillar, which is not only investment rights and property rights of that nature, but also intellectual property and other aspects of property rights. And what we find is that these three pillars are very closely correlated to GDP per capita. And what you see there, the coefficients there, essentially what that means, just to unpack that, is a 1 point increase. So this is an econometric model. It's 13 years of panel data for 150 countries or so. So each country, through a series of variables and subvariables, gets a pillar score between 1 and 7. And what this refers to, this coefficient, is what happens when you increase the pillar score of one of those pillars by 1 point. Right? So most developed countries will be scoring for most of these pillars somewhere in the range of 5, 5.2, 5.3 out of 7. So a 1 point increase is like a 20% improvement. That's the way to think about this. Very undeveloped countries, very highly distorted countries, may be scoring 3, let's say. So that's more like a 30% improvement. So that's where the difference lies between the countries. But a 1 point improvement in each of these things corresponds to this sort of number. So what I want you to notice here, and it's very consistent with what Doug was saying earlier on, is that the impact of trade openness is about a 6 or so % increase in GDP per capita. It's a state-to-state model, so it depends how long it takes you to do these things. It doesn't happen overnight, so it depends how long the period of time is before you can realise that kind of improvement. But a 6% increase in GDP per capita for the trade pillar. But what is interesting is the domestic competition pillar is more like 8%. So the impact, now traditionally when we think about trade opening, and it was referred to in the earlier panel, the transitions, for example, in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, the improvements in Eastern Europe recently, and why they came from such a low base. So we think about opening up to trade as the big thing. We still think, when you read the newspapers, you'll see lots of stuff about trade openness, and I'm a trade guy, so I like that. But the problem is that is not where the gains actually are. I mean, there are gains. You do need to improve your trade openness. It is important to do these things. Free trade is important, but that is much smaller than the gains you get from making your regulatory system more competitive, and property rights as well. So if you think about only thinking about trade openness and disregarding property rights and competition, which is essentially what we did in the transitions in the former Soviet Union and in the aperture in Latin America in the early 90s and so forth, you're not going to realise those GDP per capita gains that you would otherwise realise. And part of that is the reason why we have such slow economic growth. Anyway, if you're interested in the model, you can read about it in the book, and I will leave these at the University of Buckingham. for you. I'm sure Doug will leave his books as well for the University of Buckingham.
Pay for mine.
But you can learn more about the model, and that's what we use in the Growth Commission to evaluate, because you can actually unpick through the sub-variables various things. So just to, parenthetically, I'd say if you look at, there was a discussion about labour market flexibility earlier on today. If you look at the domestic competition pillar, a surprisingly large percentage of it, probably 20-25% of it, is labour market flexibility. So if you improve your labour market flexibility, you get much bigger gains, which is interesting because the UK is a country that is in the process of doing the reverse of that. Already with a minimum wage, which we referred to earlier, that is 2/3 of median income, much higher than the OECD average. So we have a fiction, I think, in the UK sometimes that we think we have a flexible labour market. Actually, we don't really have a flexible labour market. We certainly haven't had for many years. If you look at severance payments and so forth, it's not actually a very flexible labour market. It needs to be more flexible. So the problem. Real GDP per capita is flatlining. The previous panel discussed this in some detail, so I'm not going to dwell on it. But I think we have to, we have to come to an agreement first of all on the problem that we're trying to fix. And it is pretty clear that over the last 25 years, real GDP per capita of many countries, not just the UK, of many G7 countries has essentially flatlined. Even in the US, which has been more resilient than others over this period, it is much less than it has historically been. And there are some very important reasons for that. A lot of them are regulatory barriers that have been imposed over time. So, impact of regulation on economic growth. I've put up there some recent studies that have been done, including studies the Growth Commission has done on this. And we found in the Growth Commission that between 2015 and 2023, about 6% of UK GDP, about £143 billion, has been lost as a result of regulatory impacts. I've referred to a very interesting study by a mathematician, actually. I think he's more of a mathematician than an economist, Singham from Goethe University, who did a machine learning study on the US federal rule book, and we can talk about this in the panel discussion. But essentially, about $1 trillion increase in regulatory costs in the US over this period of time. But most interestingly is this idea that 31 to 37% of the rise in market power of incumbents in the US is attributable to the federal rule book. In other words, not business success, not having a good product, not meeting human need in voluntary exchange, but lobbying the federal rule book in order to get rules that keep out your new entrants to that market. And then in the EU, ESIPE found that 3% of EU GDP per capita is being lost as a result of anti-competitive regulation. It's about €500 billion in the EU. So the impact of regulation on economic growth is very serious. These numbers are not small numbers. This is not a rounding error. I think quite often policymakers look at fiscal issues, tax issues, trade issues as the big issues, and regulatory reform is very much a rounding error. What these studies are highlighting, and what our work I think highlights, is that that's not the case. And in fact, that's where the game needs to be played. I'm going to put this slide up. I'll have to explain this. So essentially what you have in the blue line there, what we've done is we've taken those economies that the UK likes to compare itself with, which is essentially the Western European economies. And we've taken the Western European economies, we've deliberately excluded the faster growing European economies like the Poles and the Central Eastern Europeans and the Baltics. So this is EU, ex-Baltics, and the Central Eastern Europeans. So this is about 16 countries that you typically say are Western European countries that the UK tends to compare itself with. And we've looked only at the domestic competition and the property rights pillar. And we've evaluated the distortions in those markets over this period of time. And we've seen the GDP per capita that is effectively being left on the table as a result of these distortions. So this is opportunity cost. This is what you're leaving on the table by not being able to reform because you've got an anti-competitive regulatory framework. And you can see the 26 or so percent of the EU line. The line below it is the US line. And as Dave will no doubt attest in our panel discussion later, the US is not by any means a paragon of virtue when it comes to regulatory barriers. But look at the difference between Western Europe and the US. And the reason I put this up is because, part of this conference is also to talk about, real solutions to these problems. And in order to look at real solutions, we have to look at what's actually going on in the world. And the thing that is going on in the UK at the moment is a decision to dynamically align our regulation, UK regulation, to the EU blue line, basically, up there. So your regulatory headroom for the UK, even if you only get to the level of the US, which is, as we'll talk about, is not perfect by any means, that's your regulatory headroom. That's what you're giving up, essentially, by dynamic alignment to EU regulation. Rachel Reeves in the Mays lecture essentially said that regulatory autonomy for the UK should be the exception, not the rule. So we've gone from only one area of dynamic alignment, which is in the phytosanitary area, which is one that impacts Lance very closely, to essentially it's going to be the exception. Autonomy is going to be the exception, and dynamic alignment will be the rule. And once you've dynamically aligned in an area like sanitary and phytosanitary, rules that protect animal, plant, and human health, it's a lot easier to make the argument that you should align in every other area. And that will include discussions about things that Doug mentioned in his comments about digital regulation and so forth. And the effect of that will be to put the UK forever on that top blue pathway in terms of lost opportunity, and losing the benefits of being able to have a dynamic economic growth environment. Just want to say a couple of things on this. Mention was made of Australia and New Zealand in the first panel. Australia's 57%, I think, was the GDP gain over a period. Australia and New Zealand both did an extremely good job, incidentally under Labour governments, successively, Roger Douglas and then Paul Keating in Australia, of doing significant regulatory reform. Significant regulatory reform and directly correlatable to that GDP per capita growth. In fact, the Australian Productivity Commission has noted that that contribution that regulatory reform made to and competition made to Australian GDP per capita. On dynamic alignment, if we're going to do this dynamic alignment to the EU, is that what people do? Is that something that is normal in the global system? Well, of 360 declared free trade agreements in the world, only 3% of them have some kind of version of dynamic alignment. 95+% of them have mutual recognition and equivalence. This is the norm. The EU is an outlier on this issue. And then finally, before we get into, I'll ask Lance to go first, and then Dave, and then we'll get into a conversation. Finally, what else is going on in the world? Obviously, we talked about the potential for a fiscal event or a fiscal crisis of some kind. The biggest threat we have right now in that is that the 20 million barrels of oil per day are not flowing out of the Straits of Hormuz right now. That is 20% of global consumption. Just to put that in perspective, the oil shock of the 1970s was about 7% of global production. And it is not possible to use the strategic oil reserve of the US, which is the biggest, to offset this, because it's held in 60 salt caverns in the Gulf. The infrastructure is pretty poor. You could maybe get 800,000 out per day. If the whole world did something like this, maybe 3 million. So you're down 20 and you're up 3 every day. So if anything is going to bring this to a head, I think that's probably the biggest threat we have on the horizon. And it will, as the oil shock did in the 70s, it will particularly impact countries that already have very high energy costs. And the UK has 4 times higher energy costs than the US. So with that, I will ask Lance to make some observations about I think particularly, Lance, in your sector, in your business. Sorry, we should use this. In your business, obviously it's food. Food regulation is very much being talked about right now. Talk about the impact of SPS, dynamic alignment, on your business. The kinds of regulations that you have to deal with. But give us more broadly some, discussion about what is it like to be an entrepreneur in the UK. I think you may be the only person on the panel who is currently an entrepreneur, in our event today. So give us an indication of what it's like, and what are the barriers that you face, and what can we do about them?
Thank you very much, Shanker. It seems the mics are working now. It's great. The last time I was invited to speak on a panel like this, a woman came up to me in the interval and she said, "Mr. Forman, I thought you were absolutely superfluous." So hopefully I'll do a bit better today. But if you go back a generation and you asked a businessman, how's business going? A typical response might be, well, if I didn't have clients and didn't have staff, everything would be wonderful. And that's generally where the problems were coming from. Today, if you ask a business person how business is going, they will just put their head in their hands and complain about all the red tape, the compliance, and it's literally driving us bananas. The number one reason why family businesses decide to just pack up their bags nowadays is not because they can't make a profit. It's not because there's no succession coming into the business later on. It's because the owner comes into work one day and literally just says, "I've had enough of all of this. There's enough in the bank now to retire. I'll go off and move to Dubai," or well, probably not there now, but it's just the compliance and the red tape is just wears you down, and it's grinding, and it's very problematic for, say, small family businesses. Account for about 90% of businesses in the UK. So, as you said, maybe what I should do is bring some sort of colour to the theory, talking about some examples of things we have to face. In the Brexit days, one of the things I used to talk about was how we as a business had to spend literally tens of thousands of pounds reprinting all our packaging so that a packet of smoked salmon would have a warning sign on the back saying "contains fish." It's true, and people would when I made this comment, people would accuse me of not taking food safety seriously, and I would respond that if consumers don't know that salmon's a fish, they've probably got bigger problems than food intolerances. So we have a food factory. It's full of fridges and freezers, and these walk-in sort of giant fridges, and they're all electronically monitored and very up to date, and all the latest technology. And we have audits from clients, we have audits from government bodies, environmental bodies, and so on. And they know we do these sort of fridge monitor checks. If somebody leaves the door open for too long, an alarm will go off. But they're not happy with that. What they want is for somebody from our business to go round with a clipboard and a thermometer 3 times a day, taking the temperature of the fridge and noting it down. And that's not enough. They also, every month, want us to check the thermometer against another thermometer to make sure that the thermometer is operating properly. That's not enough. Once a year, we have to send our thermometer off to an independent laboratory to have it independently calibrated to make sure that it's operating properly. We do all this stuff because we have to do it. Not long ago, we had an audit, and the auditor came along and looked at all these sheets of papers with ticks and so on, and she was like shaking her head and she said, well, this is no good. And we said, well, why is that? She said, well, because you're taking all these temperatures, but there's no signature at the bottom of the sheet to show that a manager had reviewed it and was happy with it. I reckon we spend somewhere between 10 to 20% of our labour cost doing stuff that has absolutely no value to the business whatsoever. And we all wonder why we've got a productivity crisis in this country. Completely bonkers. We had an audit a few years ago, and the auditor said to us, can I see your floor cleaning schedules? And we said, what do you mean floor cleaning schedule? She said, well, I need to check that you've cleaned the floor. I said, well, look at the floor, it's very clean. She said, yes, but how do I know? We need to know that you're cleaning it every day. I said, well, look, of course we clean it every day. We get a lot of tourists, and we have a viewing gallery, and that's a great discipline because it means the place always has to be spotless. And she said, well, yes, but I need proof that you've cleaned the floors. And I said, well, it doesn't really prove anything. You can go into a fast food restaurant, go into the toilet, and you'll see on the back of the door a little thing saying the toilet's been cleaned at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it's still only 10 in the morning. Because if there's a box, somebody will tick it. It doesn't prove anything at all. Part of the audits, that they want to check that we are auditing our suppliers too. And so we always sort of, befriend these auditors that come in. We say, look, we need to audit some people too. You look like you're doing a great job. How much do you charge for these audits? And they say, well, I'd be happy to go and do it for £250, let's say. Meanwhile, we have been charged £500 by our client for doing this audit. So it's become a profit centre. This thing has become self-sustaining. There's a whole industry that's been built up around all this regulatory stuff. And that has also become part of the problem. Around the time of Brexit, there's this, he's still around actually, very nasty radio presenter. You feel free to comment as I mention his name, LBC James O'Brien. Yeah, there you go, perfect. He would often get people phoning in, and he'd encourage them to phone in and say, what regulation would you like to be scrapped? And they'd phone in and they'd make a perfectly decent case. But of course, individually, these regulations look pretty petty. And he'd mock them, of course. And the problem is that we have 40 years of this stuff. And it's built up over the years and slowly ground us to a halt. And the question is, you can't reverse them one by one, otherwise it's going to take another 30 to 40 years. We have to slash through these regulations. And I think it is possible. And the reason I think it's possible is because of our experience over the Olympic Games. You mentioned that our business was compulsory purchase. We had a nightmare of an Olympics. But there was one good thing that I felt came out of the Olympic Games. When a city wins the rights to host an Olympics, it has to pass a piece of legislation which we call over here the Olympic Act. And the Olympic Act basically supersedes any other legislation. You could pretty much do anything to ensure that the Olympics happens according to the deadline. So, of course, you can't have the 2012 Games in 2013. That's not going to work. So you can cut through legislation by passing, in this case, the Olympic Act. You can do it, but there has to be the will to do it. And I think that is the problem we have to get around today. There's no will to cut through this legislation. But if there was a will, I think it's perfectly doable.
One of the aspects of the European regulatory system is the direction of travel. And this is also, I think, not well understood. That the European regulatory system was a very different thing in the 1990s to what it was in the 2000s and so forth. And also the ability of member states to influence it, those Central and Eastern European member states, for example. That the ability to influence it and to change it changed very dramatically with the Lisbon Treaty and other aspects of European regulation that got rid of the veto and then qualified majority voting and so forth. So the direction of travel of European regulation is to be ever more anti-competitive and more restrictive. That's particularly true in regulation that affects you, the food kind of regulation. And one aspect of that is tolerances. So there are various regulations about tolerance of things that are harmful, and usually, one would hope, sound science is applied to this. And people say you don't need to get to zero, because zero would be no risk at all, and the world is full of risk. So what is the acceptable level of risk? And when we were talking earlier on, you had a great example of this in your industry to do with listeria. Would you like to share that, and also put it in the context of what is the acceptable level of risks that we all just accept every day? When you get into your car, you're accepting a level of risk and so forth. So that's a great example, I think, if you want to share that.
Well, first of all, I should say, as we're talking about Europe, we all thought before Brexit that there were these nasty EU commissioners coming up with these rules. And I think what we learnt once we Brexited is that we were actually gold-plating a lot of these rules. And, we make it harder for ourselves. I could give you numerous examples now where British bureaucrats are making our life extraordinarily difficult, even preventing exports, when we could do things that would be beneficial to the economy, and we're holding ourselves back half the time. Doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. On the particular salmon thing, the new rules that are coming in by the EU have zero tolerance for listeria in salmon. Currently, the rule is that there can be microscopic levels. And the salmon industry in Scotland, it's Scotland's largest, in fact, it's the UK's largest food export, cannot avoid listeria. It just happens randomly sometimes, but it's in very, very small levels that won't affect anyone. It's not going to do any harm, very, very low levels. But if we align with these new rules in Europe that I think are coming in this summer, that could cause immense harm to our largest export. We looked at this a while ago, and I looked at the risk of somebody actually being seriously harmed from these levels of listeria. And actually, the risk is far, far lower than the chances of getting hurt in a car accident driving to the supermarket to buy the salmon in the first place. It is ridiculous. We just look at the detail of one thing without looking at the context, and it's a bureaucratic mindset, and we've got to get around it.
Good, and there are many, many more examples of those types of things. What we wanted to do in this panel was make a little bit real some of the numbers that they talk about, and show you some real examples of what this means on a day-to-day basis. So, Dave, let's talk about the US for a second. First of all, your experience of regulatory reform in the US and the regulatory barriers that do exist in the US. Quite interestingly, when the Trump administration came in, there was an executive order on removing anti-competitive regulation from the US. So obviously their trade policy is designed to deal with lots of barriers around the world. But they're also saying, yes, we have barriers here, and we need to deal with those in order to generate economic growth. So if you could reflect on your experience of regulatory barriers in the US.
You got it. Yeah, no, thank you. And this conference, by the way, I just applaud what you're doing in this room. It's just incredible. You in that first session was incredible. It's at the high level, macro stuff in the U.S. All of our economists are down in the weeds doing econometric studies on nothingness. And so this is just a refreshing. You're all a little too optimistic in my mind. I'm probably in the Liz Truss camp. You're relying on rationality and all these things that you've relied on for 1,000 years or so that have served you well. But today, I think you are in a war, an existential cultural war in the U.S. I know we are in a war, and so that. My comments come in the light of that. So the regulatory burden, Trump comes in and says, okay, you got to get rid of 2 for every new one you put in or something on that order. And that's small ball stuff, right? So that's okay, so you do that. But that abstracts from the bigger issues, right? Ewan had the chart of the gigantic U.S. magnificent 7 firms, largely of Facebook and Meta and all these. Those 7 firms are 40% of the S&P 500 in terms of value, right? Every one of those CEOs, with the exception of Elon, and who knows what Elon is, right? I think he's kind of a libertarian, so I love that about him. But all the rest of them are on the far left, and they censored President Trump, and yet they come in and sit on the front row when he's inaugurated. Right? Let that sink in for a minute, right? So when you talk about regulatory power or regulatory capture, those firms are all monopolies, right? So that's why I say you guys are a bit optimistic. You've got freedom stuff all over. I was a libertarian. I'm still a libertarian. It's the best case scenario on the idealistic what I'm aiming at. But the United States right now is in the middle of monopoly dominance across the field and regulatory capture that you cannot imagine if you go line by line, right? People are paying. You get one line in the budget, right? That's why the lobbyists come in. You put one line in that budget, and you think, well, the budget's a budget. You had one line of budget, and you give whoever got their state legislator or U.S. congressman, they have monopoly power, right? Because they've screened out certain companies. In COVID, Walmart, the biggest firm in the country, had a notable exclusion from all the regulations that occurred, right? To the richest, dominant, richest voice. And that happened across the board. And then you talked about the book, the rule book in the U.S. The rule book, when I was in Congress, is called the U.S. budget. I was on the United States Congress Budget Committee. They came into the room and said, hey, guys, some women in the room too, and here's your number at the end of the year. And back when I was in there, the budget deficit was small. It was only $1 trillion. I just want to see if you're paying attention. Now it's $2 trillion, right? And so they told us what the budget number was going to be 6 to 9 months ahead of time. And they said, you guys have fun twiddling your thumbs. And I'm not making this up. This was for 4 years in a row, and it's been this way forever. The Speaker of the House dictates the budget based on the rule book and also what I call the giant Excel spreadsheet in the sky. And that is the donors, right? That budget is dictated by the donors 100%. To the extent that look what Mike Johnson, the speaker, he was taught at Liberty University. I was friends with him up there. Paul Ryan preceded him. He worked at the Heritage Foundation, spent his whole life under Jack Kemp preparing to do fiscal work up there. Once he got in, right, we're going to have he was a brain. He could tell you things that were false but seemed true with language that was miraculous. I mean, he could just, and he's from Wisconsin, so he's, Minnesota. I'm from Minnesota nice and all this. He's a nice guy. But he could, and then you'd leave the meeting with him and you'd go, wow, that is kind of a true statement, but it's totally false, right, when it comes down to the numbers. And so that's why I say we're at war. The United States budget is captured. Right now, the U.S. Senate is debating the SAVE Act. Have you followed this thing? This is an 85% issue in the polling, which requires radical proposition that you bring a voter ID before you can vote. We're the only country, all European nations have this, so we don't have any ID, right? So illegal immigrant, we had 20 million illegal immigrants come in under Biden. And then when your party wants to restore the rule of law and go legal, you're a big meanie. Right? Like James Madison is a big meanie. You all know James Madison? He wrote our Constitution. He's one of my heroes out of Virginia. Right? So you want to restore just the rule of law, which is kind of fundamental to having a free market economy and stability over the long run. And you're considered the big meanie. Right? And so I could just go over example after example after example. And Shanker, if you want to lead me in the direction you want to lead me in, you just keep me going. But but let me give you I said we're in a war, and I do mean that seriously. And my presentation on institutions is going to get to that in the afternoon session. But you guys lent us one of your leading lights. His name was John Harvard. He came over and founded a little school in the U.S. in 1640. And the mission statement of Harvard was truth for Christ and church. In 16, and that was the same, the Soul of American University by Marsden. It's a nice book where it calls all the universities and everything, right? That was the motto, vision statement for 200 years for Harvard. Now it's just veritas, which is truth, But if you go to their philosophy department, they cannot define that. and I'm dead. I've gone to their philosophy department, right? And Liz will tell you she had a fine scholar named Foucault. Raise your hand if you've heard of this name, Foucault. Deconstruction, right? And Rorty, and there's several of these folks. And she said, I didn't know what they're talking about in university. She says, I got in federal government. I knew exactly what they're talking about, right? They're deconstructing the West, and they're deconstructing your civilizational requirements, right? And so when you talk about distortions, I mean, that is the greatest distortion you're going to do to an economy, is take out the philosophical, religious, cultural foundations of a country. That is the distortion. And the greatest distortion in that matter is the very tradition, right? In the U.S., James Madison, I referenced him. The book most cited by the U.S. founders, take a guess. The Bible, and the book of Deuteronomy specifically, right? It's out of the Hebrew scripture. And now the leftists, the Marxists, and in case you don't know, Marx didn't believe in God. Is that news to you? And he didn't believe in metaphysics. You with me on all this? He was a materialist, and he wasn't a very good one. There's nothing on him in philosophy at all, right? Go to your encyclopedia. There's nothing on Marx, right? Because he's a materialist who sounded like a Jewish prophet. Right? He was all about ethics and ideas and everything, but he was a materialist, right? And so that is the attack on the institutions that I think is first and foremost. We have to restore that. And there was a good question over here. How do you restore this? How do you solve it? Well, the donors in the U.S. have to quit funding these universities who are doing all leftist, woke, everything, and generating the next generation. And you need to do the same here. And your CEOs, 80% of the U.S. CEOs on the Fortune 500, just for example, are on the left. All the donations, this is empirically proven, I'm not making stuff up, right? And so those folks should be the leaders of society. They don't even want to be leftists. The CEOs are, I've met a ton of them, right? And over the course of the last 10 years or whatever, they're all kind of culturally conservative. But that's a huge distortion, right? When your ideology's gone. And so maybe I'll conclude on the last one, the green agenda, right? The green agenda. I love creation. God made the creation in my view. I said, take care of it. It's a beautiful thing. You look at the stars that reflect the glory of God, right? So that's, okay, good. We love nature. So I'm not against any of that. But if you look at that green for the past 20 years, Al Gore, I knew him back in the Methodist building 35 years ago. He was working in there on cross-religious, I was working in what do you call that? Ecumenical, right? Kind of Methodist building across from the U.S. Supreme Court with all the religions, and we all got along fine and dandy. Then this green thing comes up about then, and in the meantime, it kind of turned into a loyalty oath to a cult of some sort, where you had to bend the knee and say, I'm for the green thing. And all of our energy companies in Virginia and the U.S., Dominion, they had to do a 20% carve out to the green stuff, windmills and this, and they just knew they had to do it. It was required, right? It was regulatory capture. They didn't question it. They didn't want to do it. I knew the CEOs and the heads of whatever. And but they did it. And so now the great tell, and you want to talk about a distortion to the economy and to the energy, and now it's going to matter, right? Those poor decisions we made 20 years ago, it's really going to matter with this war. No comment on the war. And that was a joke. But the major point on the green stuff is now look at the left who orchestrated that thing down to a fine point, right? Bill and Hillary Clinton Foundation, I think they had a couple $1 billion for travel in the Clinton Foundation from international entities, which is against the law. We have FARA laws. You can't do any of that. But they had $2 billion in that fund. And now look, the big tech bros come in, the Magnificent Seven, and all of a sudden, what happened to the green initiatives? It's gone. It's not mentioned anymore. Why? Because the Magnificent Seven needs huge energy, right? By any source possible, in any way, and to heck with the trees and the gardens and the plants and the frogs or whatever, right? So I'm just trying to exaggerate things to show you that this isn't tweaks at the margin that we're talking about here, right? This is what Liz Truss was trying to do, is on the right order of magnitude. And then she said, the press said, oh, the bond market reacted. Well, what do you think they're going to do? You're threatening their turf. Of course they're going to freak out, right? You're threatening the dominance of the Federal Reserve System in the U.S. and in the central banks in here with their power. And of course they're going to freak out. But the counter question, which never gets asked, is how's the status quo doing, folks? Terrible, right? And so you cited some productivity stuff. But in the U.S., our main guy on productivity, long-run productivity growth, is Gordon out of Northwestern University. Gordon, Robert Gordon. And 70 years of decline in U.S. productivity growth. And the decline, I'll put the chart up in the later session, is the exact same thing as wage growth. Right? Just so you know, when we say make America great again and America first, it should be about those folks, the middle class, the wages, trying to get them back up. And that's what Trump pledged to do. I hope we can get there, right? So we'll see about that. But his charts on productivity growth, back 70 years ago, his productivity was at max under Reagan, or so 4, 5, even 6% here and there. Then down to 3, then down to 2. Now we're in the U.S., and I think I looked up yours, and they're pretty similar. We're at 1.5. And the Congressional Budget Office, just to show that Bob Gordon's in the right logic train, CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, has us at 1.5% growth for the next 30 years. Right? And Bob Solow, who won the Nobel Prize for Economic Growth, and Robert Gordon provides him with all the data in that growth literature on the long-run productivity stuff. He was asked, and same with Gordon, yeah, but don't you see technology all around you? And this was back in the 90s, little tech. We did get a little blip, but it wasn't significant. And they both said, yeah, I see technology everywhere, except in the data. Right? So don't let the folks fool you. This AI train, I hope it bears huge fruit, but it looks kind of like a one-firm dominance. One firm's going to win, and there's going to be a lot of malinvestment. And if we get this global shock right now, oh boy, then you're going to see we're leveraged to the hilt as usual in the U.S. We're leveraged, and if we get a shock, that's in trouble. So I'm just trying to give you a sense of urgency. We're at war. It's an economic war at minimum. For me, it's a spiritual war. I'll unpack that a little bit in the later thing. And I'm not Jonathan Edwards. I won't heighten it to that extreme. But I'll give you a mini sermon. Shanker, is that all right?
And actually, the issue of how you do reform and the incumbency problem you alluded to,
yes,
and I think you alluded to elsewhere.
Yes, I should have hit that. Good.
The status quo. How do you actually do this? What's interesting about Argentina, when people talked about Milei in the earlier session, in our model, if you look at the data between 2010 and 2023, Argentina is one of the most distorted markets in the world. So he came in with a mass of distortions and the ability to very quickly make the kind of changes that lead to some growth that people are seeing.
It's wonderful.
So it may be that the UK has to get down to that level before this happens. Quick comment or final closing comment from both of you, and then we'll go into lunch.
No, God bless the UK. Keep fighting. You're at war. Get at it.
Well, Keir Starmer said that growth was his highest priority, but since then he's had numerous other highest priorities, so he's certainly seen a growth in his priorities.